You walk into a store. You need to print a boarding pass, maybe a resume, something simple. The cashier rings you up for a new ink cartridge, $47, for barely an ounce of colored liquid. You pay it. You always pay it, because what choice do you have? Here's something that'll make your blood boil. Literally, a milliliter of printer ink costs around $5. A milliliter of human blood, about 30 cents. That's right. The stuff flowing through your veins right now is 16 times cheaper than the liquid you put in your printer. Ounce for ounce, printer ink is more expensive than vintage champagne, more expensive than mercury, more expensive than insulin in some cases, and that's not hyperbole, that's mathematics. But here's the question nobody asks. Why? What makes this liquid so valuable that companies can charge luxury perfume prices for something that costs pennies to produce? Is it rare? No. Is it difficult to manufacture? Not really. Is it some kind of technological marvel? Absolutely not. So what's going on? This isn't a story about ink. It's a story about one of the most brilliant, predatory, and perfectly legal scams in modern capitalism. A scam so sophisticated that it's been running for over 30 years. A scam that's generated hundreds of billions of dollars, and a scam that you've probably fallen for dozens of times without even realizing it. Let's go back to where it all started. 1984. Hewlett-Packard is looking at a problem. Personal computers are finally becoming affordable. They're in homes, they're in offices. But there's a missing piece. People need to get information off the screen and onto paper. They need printers, and HP has an opportunity to own an entire market, but they need a strategy. The technology exists. Dot matrix printers are around, but they're loud, slow, and the quality is terrible. Laser printers exist too, but they cost thousands of dollars. Too expensive for average consumers. So HP develops something new. The inkjet printer. It's quieter, it's faster, the quality is decent. And here's the kicker. They can make it cheap. Really cheap. 1988, HP launches the DeskJet. Price, around $1,000. That might sound expensive now, but in context, it was revolutionary. A decent laser printer cost $3,000 to $5,000. Suddenly high-quality home printing was accessible, and HP's sales exploded. Within a few years, they owned the market. Canon, Epson, Brother, they all followed with similar models. The printer industry was born. But there was a problem. A manufacturing problem. These printers were complex machines. Precision engineering. Hundreds of moving parts. And HP was selling them at barely above cost, sometimes at a loss. The profit margins were razor thin. Wall Street wasn't happy. Investors wanted returns, and HP needed a solution. Then someone in an HP boardroom had an idea. An idea so simple, so elegant, so absolutely ruthless that it would reshape the entire industry forever. They realized something crucial, something that would become the foundation of their entire business model. You only buy a printer once, but you buy ink forever. Think about that. A printer might last 5 years, 10 years, maybe longer. But during that time, the average household goes through dozens of cartridges, maybe hundreds for an office. And here's the beautiful part from HP's perspective. Once you own their printer, you're locked in. You can't use Canon ink in an HP printer. You can't use Epson cartridges in a Brother machine. Each printer requires its specific, proprietary ink. This is called the razor and blades model. Gillette perfected a century ago. Sell the razor cheap. Make your fortune on the blades. HP just applied it to printers. Sell the printer at cost, or even at a loss. Then make obscene profits on the ink, forever. And it worked. By the mid-90s, HP and its competitors had restructured their entire businesses around this model. Printer prices dropped dramatically. You could buy a decent inkjet for $200. Then $100. Then $50. Some printers were practically being given away. Black Friday sales back to school promotions, they were everywhere. Consumers thought they were getting deals. They weren't. They were being recruited into a subscription service they didn't know they'd signed up for. But here's where it gets darker. Because cheap ink wouldn't work for this model. The ink needed to be expensive. Extremely expensive. So expensive that each cartridge generated more profit than the printer itself. And the companies needed to keep it that way, which meant they needed control. Total control. They started with proprietary cartridge designs, unique shapes, unique chips, unique interfaces. You physically could not put third-party ink into these printers without significant modification. Then they added DRM, digital rights management, actual computer chips inside the cartridges that communicated with the printer. If the printer didn't recognize the chip's signature, it refused to print. Even if the cartridge was full of perfectly good ink, they took it further. Built-in expiration dates. Some cartridges would stop working after a certain date, regardless of how much ink remained. Page counters. Some would disable themselves after a predetermined number of pages, even if ink was left. Region locking. Cartridges bought in Europe wouldn't work in American printers. Firmware updates that deliberately disabled third-party cartridges that previously worked fine. This wasn't just business strategy. This was systematic market manipulation. And it was all perfectly legal. By the early 2000s, the industry had perfected the model. A typical ink cartridge cost between $2 and $5 to manufacture. That includes the plastic housing, the chip, the ink itself, everything. They sold for $30 to $70. That's a markup of 600 to 3,000%. In some cases higher. For perspective, that's a better margin than cocaine. And unlike drug dealers, printer companies didn't face jail time. They faced shareholder applause. The numbers are staggering. HP alone generates over $3 billion annually just from ink sales. That's roughly a third of their printing division revenue. But here's the insane part. While ink represents only a third of revenue, it represents nearly 2/3 of the profit. The margins are that good. Canon, Epson, Brother, they all report similar numbers. The entire industry generates around $20 billion per year from ink and toner, with profit margins that would make pharmaceutical companies jealous. And consumers, they're trapped. Because once you've bought the printer, you're committed. Switching brands means buying a whole new printer, learning new software, dealing with compatibility issues. It's easier to just pay the $40 for the cartridge. Again and again and again. But this is just the surface. Because the really diabolical part isn't just that the ink is expensive. It's how the companies keep you buying it more often than you actually need to. Here's something you've probably experienced. You print a document. The printer warns you the ink is low. You ignore it because you only need a few more pages. Then mid-job it stops. Completely. Won't print another word. You check the cartridge. You shake it. You can hear liquid sloshing around inside. There's clearly ink left. But the printer refuses to acknowledge it. Game over. Buy a new cartridge. That's not a bug. That's a feature. Printer companies engineer their cartridges to retain ink. Significant amounts of ink. Studies have found that when a cartridge reports empty, it typically contains between 15 and 40% of its original ink volume, sometimes more. One investigation by a consumer rights group found that some Epson cartridges retained up to 50% when they stopped working. 50%. Half the ink you paid for, sitting unused in a plastic shell headed for a landfill. Why? The companies claim it's necessary. They say the ink needs to remain in certain chambers to prevent air bubbles, to keep the print head from drying out, to maintain color accuracy. And there's some truth to that. A dried print head can permanently damage a printer. But 15 to 50%, that's not engineering necessity. That's manufactured waste. That's forcing customers to buy more cartridges more frequently than actually required by the technology. Then there's the color conspiracy. You want to print a black and white document, just text, simple, but your printer says no. Why? Because you're out of cyan or magenta or yellow, colors you're not even using. But the printer won't let you print black, only until you replace the color cartridge. Different manufacturers have different policies, but this happens across the industry. Some printers use color ink for black printing even when you specifically select black-only mode. They claim it's for improved quality. The real reason? It drains all your cartridges simultaneously, maximizing cartridge purchases. And speaking of cartridges running out, let's talk about the estimates. You know that little indicator that tells you how much ink remains? It's lying to you. Or at best, making an educated guess that benefits the manufacturer. These systems don't actually measure ink volume. They estimate based on coverage patterns and page counts, and they're programmed conservatively, very conservatively. The printer will tell you you're at 20% when you might actually have 35%. It'll say empty when you have enough for another 100 pages. But the manipulation goes deeper than residual ink and false readings. It's built into the fundamental design. Modern cartridges come in two main configurations. Integrated cartridges where the print head is built into the cartridge itself, and separate cartridges that slot into a permanent print head. The integrated design sounds wasteful, and it is. You're throwing away a perfectly good print head every time you replace the cartridge, but companies love it because it's more expensive. A simple ink reservoir costs almost nothing to manufacture. An integrated printhead cartridge costs a few dollars more, which means they can charge $10 or $20 more. Pure profit. The separate cartridge design seems better, but companies found a workaround. Individual color cartridges. Instead of one tri-color cartridge with cyan, magenta, and yellow together, they split them. Now you need 3 separate cartridges. Sounds consumer-friendly, right? Only replace the color you run out of. Except each individual cartridge costs almost as much as a tri-color used to. So instead of buying one $30 cartridge, you're buying 3 $25 cartridges over time. The math works beautifully for them. Then there's the ultimate insult. High-capacity cartridges, the XL or XXL versions. They contain more ink, maybe 50% more. Sometimes double. You'd expect them to cost proportionally more, right? They don't. An XL cartridge might cost 30% more than standard but contain twice the ink, which means the cost per milliliter drops dramatically, which means the standard cartridges are even more overpriced than they appear. The companies are admitting, through their own pricing, that they can sell ink cheaper. They just choose not to unless you specifically seek out the larger sizes. And even then, most consumers don't do the math. They see a higher sticker price and buy the standard cartridge, thinking they're saving money. Now let's talk about what's actually in these cartridges. What are you really paying for? Printer ink is mostly water, typically 60 to 90%. The rest is dye or pigment, depending on the formulation. Some surfactants to control flow, biocides to prevent bacterial growth, humectants to prevent drying. That's essentially it. The pigments are the expensive part, but even high-quality pigments cost maybe a few dollars per pound in bulk. And there are only a few grams in each cartridge. The actual material cost for the ink inside a cartridge. Estimates range from 50 cents to $2 depending on the formulation. Add the plastic shell, the chip, the foam and packaging. Total manufacturing cost, $2 to $5, maybe $7 for premium cartridges. You're paying $40 to $70. Independent companies tried to solve this. Third-party ink manufacturers emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s. They reverse-engineered the cartridges, made compatible versions, sold them for half the price or less. For a while, it worked. Consumers saved money. Competition existed. The market functioned properly. Then the printer companies fought back, hard. They started with legal warfare, patent infringement lawsuits, trademark claims, trade dress complaints. They argued that the cartridge design itself was proprietary, that even making a compatible shape violated their intellectual property. Some cases they won, many they lost. But the lawsuits served their purpose. They tied up third-party manufacturers in expensive legal battles, scared off potential competitors, created uncertainty in the market. When legal tactics weren't enough, they turned to technology. The chips got smarter, the DRAM got tighter. Firmware updates became weapons. In 2016, HP pushed a firmware update that bricked third-party cartridges in millions of printers overnight. Cartridges that worked fine one day suddenly showed error messages the next. HP claimed it was for quality and security. Consumer advocates called it sabotage. Class action lawsuits followed. HP eventually backed down and released a firmware fix. But the message was clear. They could flip a switch and make your third-party ink worthless whenever they wanted. Epson did something similar. Canon too. It became a pattern. Release firmware updates disguised as performance improvements. Disable third-party cartridges. Wait for the backlash, issue a partial fix, repeat. Each cycle made third-party ink less reliable, less attractive, less worth the risk for average consumers. And here's the thing. The companies always claimed these measures were about quality, about protecting consumers from inferior products. And yes, some third-party ink is bad. It can clog print heads. It can produce poor results. But plenty of third-party ink is chemically identical to OEM ink. Sometimes it's made in the same factories. The quality argument was a smokescreen. The real goal was market control. By the 2010s, they'd largely succeeded. Third-party ink still exists, but it occupies a small, precarious market share. Most consumers stick with official cartridges. Not because they're better, not because they're worth the premium, but because the companies have made the alternatives too risky, too complicated, too unreliable. But consumers weren't completely helpless. Some fought back in creative ways. Ink refilling services appeared. You bring in your empty cartridge, they inject new ink, reset the chip if needed, charge you $10. DI refill kits became popular. Syringes of ink, instructions, chip resetters, all available online for a fraction of cartridge prices. Continuous ink systems emerged. External tanks that fed ink through tubes to the printer, eliminating cartridges entirely. The printer companies hated all of it. They voided warranties for refilled cartridges. They designed cartridges that were harder to refill. They made chips that permanently disabled after one use. They engineered printers to reject continuous ink systems. They put warnings in user manuals. They scared consumers with stories of damaged printers and voided warranties. And it worked. Most people just paid. Because it was easier. Because fighting felt futile. Because $40 every few months didn't seem worth the hassle of rebellion. Even though over a printer's lifetime, those $40 purchases added up to hundreds or thousands of dollars. The business model had reached perfection. Printers practically free. Ink absurdly expensive. Alternatives systematically destroyed. Consumers locked in. Profits astronomical. And it was all completely, entirely, absolutely legal. But then something unexpected happened. Something the printer companies didn't anticipate. The world started changing. And their perfect scam started showing cracks. 2015. A woman in California named Adriana Martinez bought an HP printer. She printed her daughter's homework, birthday invitations, a few family photos, normal use. Over 2 years, she spent about $60 on the printer and nearly $400 on ink cartridges. One day she'd sat down and did the math. She'd spent more on ink than some people spend on groceries in a month. She got angry. Angry enough to do something most people never do. She filed a lawsuit. Martinez wasn't alone, other consumers joined. The lawsuit alleged that HP deliberately designed cartridges to retain excessive ink, that the low ink warnings were premature, that the company was systematically defrauding customers by selling cartridges that didn't deliver the advertised yield. It wasn't the first lawsuit against printer companies. It wouldn't be the last, but it represented something important. Consumers were waking up. The case eventually settled. HP didn't admit wrongdoing. They never do. But they paid out millions, changed some practices, adjusted some warnings, small victories, but the dam had cracked. Around the same time, environmental concerns were mounting. E-waste was becoming a global crisis, and printer cartridges were a significant contributor. Americans alone throw away 375 million cartridges every year. Most end up in landfills. Each cartridge contains plastic that takes up to 1,000 years to decompose, plus residual ink with chemicals that leach into soil and groundwater. The environmental cost of the razor and blades model was becoming impossible to ignore. Regulators started paying attention. The European Union began investigating planned obsolescence in consumer electronics. Printer cartridges fell under scrutiny. Right to repair movements gained momentum. Activists argued that consumers should be able to refill cartridges, use third-party ink, and repair their own devices without manufacturer interference. Legislation was proposed. Some passed. The legal landscape was shifting. But the real threat came from an unexpected direction. Technology itself. Smartphones happened. Tablets happened. Cloud computing happened. The paperless office that people had been predicting since the 80s was finally, actually starting to materialize. People were printing less. Boarding passes on phones. Bills paid online. Photos shared digitally. Documents signed electronically. The average household's printing needs were dropping year over year. The printer companies were selling fewer printers. And more importantly, people were buying less ink. Revenue started declining, not catastrophically, but noticeably, and Wall Street noticed. The companies needed a new strategy. They found one. Subscription services. HP Instant Ink launched in 2013. Here's how it works. You don't buy cartridges anymore. You pay a monthly fee. $5, $10, $15 depending on your plan. HP monitors your printer remotely. When you're running low, they automatically ship new cartridges. Sounds convenient. And for some people it genuinely is. But look closer. You're not paying for ink, you're paying for pages. The $5 plan gives you 50 pages per month. Doesn't matter if you print all text or full color photos. 50 pages. If you print 51, you pay overage fees, or you upgrade to a higher tier. And here's the catch. The Cartridges HP sends you a lock to your subscription. If you cancel, those cartridges stop working immediately, even if they're full. You don't own the ink, you're renting it. This is the future the printer companies want. Recurring revenue, predictable cash flow, total control, no third-party alternatives, no refilling, no ownership, just endless monthly payments. For some users, it's actually cheaper than buying cartridges. But for others, it's more expensive. And regardless, it represents a fundamental shift from selling products to selling services, from ownership to subscription, from one-time purchases to permanent dependency. Other companies followed: Epson ReadyPrint, Canon Autorefill, Brother Refresh. Different names, same model. And slowly, steadily, consumers are adopting them because they're marketed well, because the math seems reasonable, because people are tired of cartridge shopping, and because the alternative, buying traditional cartridges, has become so expensive and frustrating that a subscription feels like relief. But some companies took a different approach. Epson introduced EcoTank printers. Instead of cartridges, they have large refillable tanks. You buy bottles of ink and pour them in yourself. The printers cost more up front, $300, $400, $500. But the ink is cheap. A set of bottles costs $30 and lasts for thousands of pages. The total cost of ownership, over time, is dramatically lower. Canon followed with Megatank. HP launched Smart Tank. Brother introduced iInvestment Tank. The technology isn't new. It's essentially the continuous ink systems that hobbyists had been hacking together for years. But now it was official, sanctioned, marketed. Why the change? Because the subscription model wasn't converting everyone. Because environmental pressure was mounting. Because competitors were gaining market share. And because some executives realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a market for printers that didn't actively screw the customer. Revolutionary thinking. The tank printers are selling, not as well as traditional cartridge printers, but steadily, and the customer satisfaction ratings are significantly higher. Turns out people like products that don't feel like scams. Who knew? Yet the cartridge model isn't dead. Far from it. Millions of cartridge printers are still sold every year. Billions of dollars in ink revenue still flows. The infrastructure is too entrenched. The profit margins too attractive. The business model too successful. It'll take decades for tank printers and subscriptions to fully replace cartridges, if they ever do. Meanwhile, third-party manufacturers are adapting. Some are making compatible cartridges for tank systems. Others are focusing on commercial markets where high-volume printing still relies on traditional technology. A few are developing new models entirely. Print as a service for businesses, blockchain-verified cartridges, biodegradable ink pods. The market is evolving slowly, but evolving. So where does that leave us? What's the actual answer to why printer ink costs more than human blood? It's not technology, it's not rarity, it's not manufacturing difficulty, it's business strategy, pure and simple. Printer companies discovered they could charge luxury prices for a commodity product if they controlled the entire ecosystem. They built a system where consumers had no choice, no alternatives, no leverage. They turned a simple product into a captive market, and they defended that market with patents, DRM lawsuits, and firmware updates. It's one of capitalism's purest expressions. Not innovation, not competition, not value creation, just market manipulation executed flawlessly, a legal monopoly on a necessary product. The razor and blades model perfected to such a degree that it stopped being a business strategy and became something closer to exploitation. And we accepted it. Because what choice did we have? You need to print. Your kid needs to print homework. Your job requires documents. You can't not have a printer, so you pay. You always pay. That's the brilliance of it. They didn't sell us something we wanted. They created a need, then made themselves the only solution, then charged whatever they wanted. And we had to say yes. But here's the philosophical question underneath all of this. What does it say about our economic system that this is possible? That a company can sell ink for more than blood and face no consequences? That profit margins of 2,000% on a necessary product are not only legal but celebrated by investors? That engineering deliberate waste into products is considered smart business? Some would argue this is just how markets work. Supply and demand. If people are willing to pay, why shouldn't companies charge? If you don't like it, don't buy it. The free market solves everything, except it doesn't. Because this isn't a freed market, it's a captured market. When switching costs are high, When alternatives are systematically destroyed, when proprietary technology locks consumers in, you don't have a market. You have a hostage situation. Others would argue this is a failure of regulation, that governments should have stepped in decades ago. Banned proprietary cartridges, mandated standardization, enforced right to repair. Maybe they're right, but regulations are slow, lobbying is powerful, and by the time governments act, the companies have already moved to the next model. Subscriptions, cloud integration, always one step ahead. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Markets need rules. Competition needs protection. Innovation needs balance. And consumers need advocates. None of that happened here. So we got a product that costs pennies to make, sells for dollars, and generates billions in profit while creating mountains of plastic waste. We got an industry built on manufactured scarcity and artificial limitations. We got printer ink that costs more than human blood. The question isn't whether this will end. It already is ending. Slowly. Tank printers, subscriptions, declining print volumes, environmental regulations. The old model is dying. The question is what replaces it. Will it be better? Or will it be the same exploitation in a different form? Subscriptions that trap you in different ways. Smart printers that mine your data. New technologies with new lock-ins. The printer industry taught other industries a valuable lesson. If you can make the product cheap and the consumables expensive, if you can lock customers into your ecosystem, if you can eliminate alternatives and normalize absurd pricing, you can generate extraordinary profits for decades. This playbook has been copied everywhere. Coffee pods, video game consoles, electric car charging, pharmaceutical delivery devices. Everywhere you look, you'll find razors and blades. So the next time you print something, and your printer demands a new cartridge, and you're paying $47 for an ounce of colored water, remember this. Remember that it's not an accident. It's not market forces. It's not inevitable. It's a choice. A choice made by companies that decided profit mattered more than fairness, more than sustainability, more than treating customers with basic respect. And remember that you have choices too. You can buy a tank printer. You can go paperless where possible. You can demand better from manufacturers. You can support right to repair legislation. You can refuse to accept that this is just how things have to be. Because printer ink doesn't have to cost more than human blood. It costs more than blood because we let it. And if we let it, we can unletting it. One refilled cartridge at a time. One tank printer purchase at a time. One regulation at a time. Change is possible. It's just not profitable. At least not for the companies currently winning. But maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why it's necessary. The ink has been spilled. The question is whether we keep